This is a presentation on the early part of the Cold War. And first of all, I think we ought to define what the Cold War was. The Cold War was a war of nerves, of threats, of fears that one side would attack the other. Uh, at times, it turned into a hot war in places like Korea or Vietnam or Afghanistan. But for the most part, it was just a war of intimidation, a war of threats, a war that could have turned into World War III, but fortunately never did. Now, this map will give us an idea of how the world was divided. The two main enemies in the Cold War were the United States and the Soviet Union. Now, the countries in light blue, such as Canada and Mexico, and all of South America, and the countries of Western Europe, were allies of the United States. And the countries in lighter red, mainly the bank of countries on the western border of the Soviet Union in Eastern Europe, were allies of the Soviets. Now, in addition to that, these countries in yellow were other communist countries, such as especially China, Mongolia, Vietnam, depending on when you're talking about, Laos and Cambodia, and Cuba. Also, Albania and Yugoslavia. They were communist countries, but they weren't necessarily allied with the Soviet Union. Now, the great countries are non-aligned. That means they didn't take sides between the two superpowers, although sometimes one would tilt more toward the United States or more toward the Soviet Union. And a lot of the conflict in the Cold War was over struggling to gain the support of these non-aligned countries, so that the side that gained their support would become stronger. That was an issue with India and Pakistan. It was certainly an issue in these countries of the Middle East and in some African countries. Now, a lot of the issues of the Cold War came up at Yalta. This was a conference held in February 1945 while World War II was still going on. By that time, it was obvious that the fall of Germany was only a matter of time. Nobody knew exactly when Germany would be defeated, but it wouldn't be that long. Now, the three major allies in World War II were called the Grand Alliance, and they were represented by Winston Churchill of Britain, by Franklin Roosevelt of the United States, and by Joseph Stalin of the Soviet Union. Now, Yalta had four critically important issues. One was Poland. What would happen to Poland? There were two governments in Poland, one that had escaped when the Germans invaded, and the other that was set up by the Soviet Union. Stalin promised there would be free elections in Eastern Europe, and especially Poland. He broke the promise. Now, what that means, we'll talk about more when we look at a map. But that was a major point of conflict between the United States and the Soviet Union. The second issue was Japan. The Soviets agreed to enter the war against Japan 3 months after Germany's surrender. Now, that was something that President Roosevelt wanted, so that he would have the assistance of the Soviet Union, the Red Army, the largest land army in the world, to help relieve American casualties if there had to be a major invasion of Japan. Now, Germany surrendered May 8th, so that meant the Soviets entered the war, promised to enter the war against Japan on August 8th, and that they did. The third issue was the United Nations. You'll probably remember from the period after World War I that there was a League of Nations, but that collapsed in the conflict leading to World War II. And so they started, the United States and other countries started another organization of nations, still around today, called the United Nations. They were divided into a couple of main parts. They had a General Assembly that consisted of every nation in the world, and each nation would have one vote. But the major nations were not about to allow a group of small countries to order them around. So in addition to the General Assembly, there was a Security Council, and that's where much more power really lay. The Security Council at first was made up of 11 nations, later expanded to 15, but 5 nations had veto power in the Security Council. That would be the United States, the Soviet Union, Britain, France, and China. Now, before the Security Council could do anything, every one of those 5 permanent members had to approve it. If even one of them vetoed it, then that idea would be shot down. It wouldn't happen. So of these 5 nations with veto power, what that did was reassure them that nothing was going to happen, nothing major against their will, but it made it far more difficult for the United Nations to take strong action. The 4th issue addressed at Yalta was the future of Germany. Germany was going to be divided into 4 zones of occupation, and Berlin too would be divided into 4 zones of occupation. Now, it's better if I explain that while we're looking at a map. You'll notice there are these zones of occupation go along with the major powers. The British zone is the one closest to Britain. The U.S. zone is in southern Germany, southern and central. The French zone are these areas that share a border with France, and the Soviet zone is to the east. Now, in addition to that, you have the city of Berlin divided into 4 zones. There is a British, an American, a French, and a Soviet zone. Now, what happened not too long after World War II is that the 3 Western zones, U.S., British, and French, all united in Germany to form the nation of West Germany, and the Soviet zone became East Germany. Now, in Berlin, the same thing happened. The 3 Western zones became West Berlin, and the Soviet zone became East Berlin. Now, you'll notice here that this divided city of Berlin is completely surrounded by the Soviet zone, and that would be a source of enormous tension in the years to come. Now, this area right here, this line right here, became known as the Iron Curtain. Winston Churchill coined that phrase in 1946 while visiting the United States. And throughout the Cold War, there was a lot of talk about the Iron Curtain. East of the Iron Curtain over here was the area dominated by the Soviet Union, and west of the Iron Curtain were the areas that were allied to the United States. Now, you might wonder about Austria here. Originally, it was divided into 4 zones of occupation, but then Austria reunited, and they agreed to become a non-aligned nation. They would not side with either the U.S. or the Soviet Union, and at that point, the Soviets agreed to let Austria reunite, and that's why the Iron Curtain is along the eastern border of Austria and not in the middle of it like it is in Germany. As I said, Winston Churchill, now the former British Prime Minister, visited Fulton, Missouri, in President Truman's home state of Missouri, and gave a very, very famous speech, his Iron Curtain speech. If you go to the PDF version of this presentation, you can see it. It's also something that we will see in class. And he warned the United States of this growing division between the Western countries and the Soviet allied countries. Okay, this is an overall map of Europe during this time. You can see that the Iron Curtain extends all the way uh, from north to south in the dividing Europe into two parts, Eastern Europe and Western Europe, with these Eastern countries being uh, allied with the Soviet Union, or really it could be called puppets of the Soviet Union, meaning that they seemed to be independent, but the Soviet Union was like the puppet master behind the scenes, pulling the strings and telling them what to do. Uh, there are a couple of different ways to look at this map. You could say, well, these are countries that are communist, and that would be true. You could also say that they're countries along the east or the western border of the Soviet Union. Uh, Now, you have to look at this from the Soviet point of view also. They were very afraid of being invaded. This would have been true even if we were dealing with a Russian Tsar, even if there were no communism in the Soviet Union. Uh, Remember that Russia was invaded from the west in 1812 by Napoleon, and it was invaded in World War I in 1914 by Germany, and it was invaded again by Germany in 1941. And each time, Russian citizens suffered horribly, unimaginably, in these invasions. So any Russian would want to protect his country from another invasion from the West. So it makes sense that there would be a buffer zone of countries that would be friendly to Russia. On the other hand, the Soviets were communists, and these were also communist countries. Now, uh, how you thought about the Cold War depended on how you interpreted the Soviet actions. Were they acting as Russians, and therefore we need to put them at ease, or were they acting mainly as communists, and therefore we need to take a very hard line against them? That was the disagreement. Now, those who wanted to say the Soviets were acting like Russians were called doves. Doves are symbols of peace. Those who said, wait a minute, they're acting like communists, were hawks. They were much more aggressive, much more opposed to Soviet actions, much more willing to take strong action themselves. Now, doves said, well, the solution is to ease off on the military buildup, because our putting all those bases all over the world is going to provoke the Soviets and ratchet up tensions and make the Cold War more dangerous. Now, the Hawks said exactly the opposite. They said, if we're weak, then the Soviets will become bolder. So the way to deal with them is to be militarily strong. Um, these are direct opposites. You can't very well compromise between the two um, because they go in totally opposite directions. Now, during the Cold War, the United States was basically hawkish. Now, in the late 40s, there were a number of major events. You could call them, in a sense, battles of the Cold War, although they were not uh, actual warfare. Um, they come from the fact that the United States and the Soviet Union no longer had a common enemy. There's a saying that the enemy of my enemy is my friend, uh, and that common enemy during World War II, of course, was Germany. But now Germany has been defeated. So whatever held the U.S. and the Soviet Union together as allies during World War II was no longer present, and it didn't take long for them to drift apart and become more enemies than allies. Uh, the situation came to a head in different places at different times. The first major issue came in Greece in 1947. There was a communist attempted revolution in Greece against the king, who was favorable toward the U.S. and Britain. Uh, this was actually not a revolution sponsored by Stalin in Moscow, but the U.S. Tended to see it that way. Uh, President Truman's response was to ask for massive amounts of aid to Greece. Congress agreed, and the aid to Greece prevented Greece from falling into the communist realm. This becomes what is known as the Truman Doctrine. The Truman Doctrine says that whenever any nation is threatened with communism, the United States stands ready to aid them. Now, Truman talked about two halves of the same walnut, two sides of the same thing. The Truman Doctrine was the negative side. You know, if anybody is threatened with becoming communist, we will act aggressively to stop that. The Marshall Plan was the positive side. The United States believed that if the world, or if Western Europe was not to become communist, and they were especially thinking of countries like Italy and France and West Germany, that we had to make sure that they were economically stable, that they had hope, that people had enough to eat, that they had the necessities of life, that they could rebuild their economies that were so badly devastated in World War II. And the Marshall Plan did that. It provided enormous amounts of aid from the United States to Western Europe. Some of this was humanitarian aid because we were genuinely sympathetic to the situation that many Europeans faced. There were also other dimensions to it, though. For one thing, it would help shore up Western Europe against communism, prevent communism from spreading, and that was a major American goal. And another thing was that those goods that were sent to Europe were produced by American companies, so that was a stimulus for the U.S. economy. A basic principle of the Cold War for the United States was the doctrine of containment. Think of this as the U.S. having three options. One option would be to go in with guns blazing and remove communism from wherever it was in the world. This would involve World War III. The United States did not have any desire to start World War III, and certainly the American people were strongly opposed to that. So it wasn't realistic to say we were going to go to war to root out communism from everywhere where it existed. The other extreme would have been to say, well, let's become isolationist again. Who cares what happens in Western Europe? Who cares what happens elsewhere in the world? We'll just retreat within our own hemisphere and enjoy our prosperity from the period after the war. Americans did not, or at least American presidents were not willing to do this either. They believed that it was necessary to be involved in the world. So containment was the middle ground. We were not going to try to roll back communism where it was already, but we were going to work very hard to keep it from spreading. In other words, we were going to contain it. One of the tests of containment came in Berlin. Remember from that map that Berlin was surrounded by the Soviet zone, by the Soviet territory, and eventually East Germany. Well, in 1948, Stalin of the Soviet Union blockaded all the ground routes to Berlin, the road and rail routes from West Germany to Berlin. This was a city of 2.5 million people, and he assumed that Berlin could not survive, so that it would have no choice but become part of the Soviet zone. Again, President Truman was faced with three choices. Start a war over this? He didn't want to do that. Just let Berlin go? He didn't want to do that either. So in keeping with the doctrine of containment, Truman began an airlift. For about 11 months or so, the United States brought everything that West Berlin needed to the city by air. And this was an amazing achievement. There were hundreds of flights every day. The British supported this also. And they even brought things like coal to Berlin. Nobody carries coal by air, but they did. And it was very successful. And then in 1949, Stalin gave up the blockade. Now, 49 was a critical year. The United States endured a couple of major shocks that year. One was that the Soviet Union had gained the atomic bomb. They tested it. And this was doubly shocking because they had gained a lot of this knowledge by spying in the United States. So this made the American people very worried about that and helped form the basis for what would be called the Red Scare in years to come. Uh, the Soviets would have gotten the atomic bomb a few years later. There was no way that they could be prevented from getting it entirely, but a lot of Americans didn't fully appreciate that, and it looked like this was simply a result of spying. What the spying did was speed up the process, but it wasn't essential to it. The United States, in response to that, um, worked on a hydrogen bomb, which was an even more powerful bomb using fusion, and it was hundreds of times more powerful than the bomb that was dropped on Hiroshima. This, of course, led to a massive arms race throughout most of the Cold War. Now, the other shock of 1949 was the Chinese Revolution. Uh, they had been fighting each other since well before the war, the communists and the what are called the nationalists. Uh, but during the war, they called a truce so they could work together to fight the Japanese. But after the war, the Civil War, after World War II, the Civil War started up again. And on October 1st, 1949, Mao Zedong, one of the most important people of the 20th century, proclaimed a new nation called the People's Republic of China. Now, the nationalists fled to a relatively small island off the coast of China known as Taiwan. Both the mainland Chinese and the Taiwanese claim to be the only legitimate government of China. And that disagreement exists right down to the present day, even though, for most purposes, they appear to be completely independent countries now. But neither of them will accept that as the permanent solution. Now, these two events form the context of the United States' determination to hold the line in Korea. We were committed to containment, but now this massive country, China, that held close to a quarter of the world's population, had become communist. And then in 1950, when they invaded Korea, or when the North Koreans invaded South Korea, then to the United States, this was a place where they had to draw the line. And in the next presentation, we will deal with the Korean War.